It was the sort of June afternoon that inspires one to compose odes to the English climate, if only to curse it with adequate precision. Lord Peter Wimsey, whose Daimler had selected a particularly exposed stretch of Dorset Road to succumb to a puncture, found himself contemplating the Channel's sullen expanse, hat in hand and monocle firmly in place. With an air of polite reproach, one might almost suspect, he muttered to the indifferent wind, that the sea has been reading the minor poets again. All this dramatics, and for what? A flat tire and a bruised ego. He was rescued from the contemplation of maritime melancholy by the appearance of the Reverend Arthur Treadgold, emerging from the shelter of his rectory gate. The vicarage, huddled in its laurels like a well-mannered but underfunded scholar, radiated a faded respectability that spoke of more prosperous centuries and fewer leaks in the roof. "Lord Peter," cried the vicar, his voice swelling with the satisfaction of a man who has at last found a use for his best tea service. "This is a rare treat. Do come in and take the chill off, unless you fancy being blown into the next parish." Inside, the drawing-room was a shrine to the genteel decay of a certain English ideal. Threadbare Axminster, an aspidistra of puritanical aspect, and the faint, persistent whiff of camphor and cold mutton, Mrs. Treadgold, brisk and practical, relieved Wimsey of his coat with the efficiency of a woman who has long since learned to manage both parish and husband. "We are early for tea," she declared, "but Lady Kellow is waiting. Dr. Puckridge has been summoned to Sir Lionel, and her nephew Martin will fetch her presently." Lady Kellow entered on a gust of black silk and suppressed drama, a widow 5 years, dressed as if for a matinee of Hamlet, all velvet composure and ironic gaze. Her nephew Martin hovered at her elbow, a young man of impatient shoulders, and a smile perpetually on the verge of wit or rebellion. "Lord Peter," Lady Kellow intoned, extending a hand with the gravitas of a minor royal, "how providential that your misfortunes have delivered you to our threshold. Dorset is not without its consolations. Time, as Horace, no Virgil, observed," Wimsey replied, "is the most unscrupulous thief. It steals not only our youth but our appointments, our weather, and on particularly truculent days, our means of transport." The company migrated to the drawing-room, where the wind rattled the French windows, and the marble clock on the mantel chimed 3 with a peevish insistence on its own chronology. From the church, the muffled bell muttered its complaint to the air. Tea was served with the solemnity of a minor sacrament. Mrs. Treadgold, generalissimo of the teapot, directed the ritual. "Lemon, Lord Peter. Vicar, no more sugar. Lady Kellow, milk, 2 lumps. Martin, if you must, there is crab-apple." "There is always crab-apple," Martin observed, accepting his fate. "It is the immortality bestowed by parish committees." Wimsey, reclining gingerly on the horsehair sofa, let his gaze wander idly, though nothing in that gaze was ever idle. He noted the sewing basket with its false bottom, the teapot's unsubtle lapsang aroma, the aspidistra's cicatrice, and the flickering tongue of the gas fire, teased by a draught from the half-open window. The arrangement of spoons, the tiny ring of damp beneath the milk jug, the tremor in Mrs. Treadgold's hand as she poured, all catalogued, all filed. "Dear me," Lady Kellow said, glancing toward the church, "that bell, it sounds like a curate with a grievance." "It is muffled for Mrs. Venn's funeral," the vicar explained, "but its effect on the living is regrettably undampened." Martin, emboldened by jam, began a witticism, thought better of it, and reached for his teacup. A moment later, his expression twisted, an ugly, fleeting distortion, as though he had glimpsed something unspeakable in the depths of his own reflection. He rose, staggered, entangled himself with the aspidistra, and collapsed to the floor with a slow, almost apologetic finality. "Martin!" Mrs. Treadgold exclaimed, half in anger, half in alarm. Lady Kellow's cup paused in mid-air. Her composure sharpened rather than cracked. Wimsey, moving with the efficiency of a man assessing a rare carpet for water damage, rang for the doctor before kneeling beside the fallen youth. Dr. Puckridge, summoned by fate or foresight, entered on the tail of a draught and performed his grim task with the resigned expertise of a man accustomed to arriving just after the curtain has fallen. "Heart failure," he pronounced. "That is to say, death. Those two, I find," murmured Wimsey, "prefer to arrive together." Lady Kellow set her cup delicately upon its saucer. It was full. A silence descended, thick as the Dorset fog. The muffled bell continued its unreasonable liturgy, the French clock declined to reach 4, and the aspidistra stood affronted. Mrs. Treadgold, recovering by force of habit, directed the vicar to call the police, and fretted over the teacups. Wimsey forestalled her. No, let them be. Sometimes only the teacups know the truth. Lady Kellow regarded Wimsey with a gaze that measured rather than pleaded. Lord Peter, I presume you will soon instruct us that this was not heart failure. I am a widow, disbelieving perhaps, but not hysterical. On the contrary, Wimsey replied, I have never met a less hysterical widow. I only wish to note for the record that while time is irreparable, tea with care may be mended, but not always. He lifted the silver lid of the teapot, sniffed and set it down with a faint air of regret. It is the widow's teacup that interests me, he added, almost apologetically. You see, it is full. His gaze swept the table. Crumbs, damp rings, the absurd owl-shaped tea cosy, and the untouched cup gleaming like a full moon in a chilly sky. He looked, to all appearances, only slightly inconvenienced by the interruption. Yet beneath the surface the game had begun, the game in which nothing is trivial, and even the silence of a teacup may speak volumes. The parish constable arrived with the measured tread of a man who had learned that haste, in matters of sudden death, generally served only to multiply the paperwork. Constable Milham possessed the sort of square-jawed respectability that suggested years of dealing with poached pheasants and matrimonial disputes, though his eyes held the wariness of one who suspected that this particular Tuesday might prove more complex than his usual fare. Inspector Craddock will be along presently, he announced, producing a notebook that bore the scars of many a village crisis. Meanwhile, we'll have preliminary statements. Natural causes, most likely, but procedure must be observed. Wimsey, who had been studying the geometric precision with which Mrs. Treadgold had arranged the antimacassars, looked up with the mild interest of a connoisseur examining a particularly fine specimen of bureaucracy. Quite right, Constable, though I wonder if we might first establish the precise choreography of our little domestic ballet. Time, as the philosophers remind us, is a most unreliable witness, unless properly cross-examined. Mrs. Treadgold, who had been hovering over the tea service with the protective instincts of a mother superior, guarding the communion wine, straightened her shoulders with renewed purpose. I served tea at precisely 3:15 as always. The clock had just chimed. Martin took his usual place by the French windows, complained eternally of the draught, yet would sit nowhere else. His usual place? Wimsey inquired, as if the phrase contained hidden theological significance. Every Tuesday and Friday, regular as clockwork, Mrs. Treadgold confirmed with the satisfaction of one whose domestic arrangements had achieved the status of natural law. Lady Kellow's nephew was most devoted to his aunt, and to my crab-apple preserve. Lady Kellow's expression suggested that devotion might be too generous a term. Martin was punctual in his affections, certainly, though I suspect cook's seed cake held more attraction than my conversation. He had recently returned from what he termed an educational sojourn on the continent. Paris, I believe, and other centres of modern enlightenment. The slight emphasis she placed on educational conveyed volumes about her opinion of continental influences on impressionable young men. Wimsey had drifted toward the tea table, where he stood contemplating the arrangement with the absorbed attention of an archaeologist examining recently unearthed pottery. Mrs. Treadgold, would you be so kind as to demonstrate the exact sequence of your service? Who was served first, in what order, and with what particular requirements? Mrs. Treadgold, clearly gratified to have her expertise recognized by someone of quality, assumed her position behind the teapot with renewed authority. Lady Kellow first, naturally. Milk, 2 lumps of sugar, though she declined to drink today on account of some superstition about funerals. Then the vicar, milk, no sugar, he watches his constitution. Martin next. He preferred it quite weak, with just a splash of milk. No sugar, mind you. Said it dulled the intellect, though he was liberal enough with the jam. And the sequence never varied? Never. Martin was most particular about such things. Said ritual was the foundation of civilization, one of his continental notions. I expect. Wimsey nodded thoughtfully, then crouched beside the fallen youth without touching, merely observing the angle of the arm. the scuffed carpet where a heel had dragged, a smear on the aspidistra's ceramic pot. He reached across himself, he observed aloud. Right-handed, yet the jam was positioned to his left. He must have leaned considerably. He made some poor jest about immortality and crabapple, Lady Kellow supplied with faint distaste. His humour was as modern as his politics, which is to say, incomprehensible to those of us educated in a more classical tradition. Constable Milham, who had been scribbling industriously, looked up with the expression of a man who sensed undercurrents beyond his jurisdiction. "Begging your pardon, my lady, but what sort of politics?" "The sort," Lady Kellow replied with Arctic precision, "that young men acquire in foreign capitals, along with dubious facial hair and an unfortunate tendency to quote German philosophers at breakfast." "Might I suggest," Wimsey interjected gently, "that we hear from the domestic staff? In my experience, servants observe a great deal more than they are credited with, and considerably more than their employers suspect." The kitchen yielded its secrets reluctantly. Elsie, the between-maid, emerged from the scullery with the pinched face and pink fingers of one who spent her days in intimate communion with cold water and carbolic soap. Under Wimsey's gentle questioning, she revealed herself to be a repository of domestic intelligence. "The tea was made as always, sir. I warmed the pot on the hob, scalded it proper, and put in 2 good spoonfuls from the lapsang canister. The water boiled a full minute. There's a draught from the back door, and if you don't let it boil proper, it sulks something dreadful." "And the sugar?" "Lumps, sir, from the silver basin, kept in the top dresser drawer with the Sunday napkins. Mrs. Treadgold is most particular about the sugar basin. It's not to be left on the sideboard except for company." Wimsey examined the kitchen with the methodical attention of a general surveying a battlefield. The lapsang canister yielded nothing but the expected aroma of smoke and distant mountains. The milk jug, recently rinsed, bore no trace of anything more sinister than Jones's dairy. But when he opened the top dresser drawer, his eyebrow rose with interest. "These napkins are damp," he observed. Elsie coloured prettily. "I ironed them this morning, sir. They hadn't quite cooled when I put them away. Cook said to let them breathe, but Mrs. Treadgold was that sharp about the parlour clock being slow, and then the muffled bell." She shuddered slightly. "The sound of it fair gives me the shivers, sir." Mrs. Bunting, the cook, proved to be a formidable woman whose opinions on life were as robust as her sweat puddings. She stood before Constable Milham with arms folded, radiating an aura of aggrieved righteousness. "Nothing out of the ordinary, not a blessed thing," she declared when questioned. "Young Mr. Martin was bright as a button when he arrived. Said he'd had a good constitutional and was ready for a proper tea. Always polite he was, though full of strange notions picked up abroad. Last week he tried to convince me that the French put wine in their cooking, as if good English beef needed foreign spirits to make it palatable." "Did he seem unwell?" Milham inquired hopefully. "Fit as a fiddle," Mrs. Bunting replied firmly, though he did keep glancing about the drawing-room in a peculiar fashion. At the mantelpiece mostly, though whether he was admiring the vicar's late wife's watercolours or timing the clock, I couldn't say. When the preliminary interviews concluded, Constable Milham looked as bewildered as a man who had set out to catch a pickpocket and found himself pursuing a will-o'-the-wisp. "Well then, Lord Peter, there you have it. Natural causes, clear as daylight. Not a soul saw anything untoward." "Indeed," Wimsey agreed, though his tone suggested that nothing might prove to be the most significant evidence of all. "Yet I find myself intrigued by the precision of it all, the exact timing, the established ritual, the careful positioning of each element. Rather like a well-rehearsed theatrical performance, wouldn't you say?" Lady Kellow set down her still full teacup with a decisive click. "Lord Peter, if you have suspicions, I wish you would voice them plainly. This mystification serves no one. On the contrary." "My dear lady," Wimsey replied with his most disarming smile, "mystification serves truth, which, as Pontius Pilate discovered, can be a most inconvenient guest at the best regulated households. But you are quite right to demand clarity. Tomorrow, perhaps, when I have had the opportunity to examine young Martin's continental correspondence, we might achieve a more satisfactory understanding of this afternoon's domestic tragedy." He glanced once more at the untouched teacup, its contents grown cold in their porcelain prison, and smiled with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had found his first piece of a very complex puzzle. The widow's teacup, he reflected, was proving far more eloquent than any of the afternoon's witnesses, and considerably more honest. Inspector Craddock arrived with the methodical authority of a man who expected Tuesday afternoons to involve poached pheasants, rather than poisoned nephews. His motorcar announced itself with a dignified wheeze that suggested both official importance and a certain skepticism about the reliability of rural mechanics. He was a lean, sharp-featured individual whose eyes held the patient intelligence of one who had learned that obvious solutions were usually correct, and occasionally spectacularly wrong. "Lord Peter," he said, accepting Mrs. Treadgold's offer of the parlour chair with the wary gratitude of a man whose profession required more standing than sitting. "Constable Milham's preliminary report suggests natural causes, though given your presence, I suspect we're to encounter something rather more complex than a simple cardiac episode." Wimsey, who had been contemplating the geometric precision of the antimacassars, looked up with the mild interest of a connoisseur examining a particularly fine specimen of bureaucratic optimism. "Indeed, Inspector, though I find myself intrigued less by the complexity than by the timing. Young Martin appears to have possessed an almost theatrical sense of occasion." Craddock's examination of the scene proceeded with professional thoroughness. He noted the position of the body, the arrangement of the tea service, and the faint smear on the aspidistra's ceramic pot where Martin's heel had dragged during his collapse. When he searched the deceased's pockets, his expression grew increasingly thoughtful. "Well, well," he murmured, withdrawing a folded letter on heavy paper. "Lady Kello, I believe this concerns you." The letter, when read aloud, cast an entirely different light on the afternoon's tragedy. "My dear Martin, your demands are insupportable. I will not be compelled to continue paying for what you so charmingly call our family silence. I enclose a cheque for £300, which shall be the last. If you persist, I shall take advice and publish what you threaten." A.K. Lady Kello received this revelation with the composure of one who had long since learned that dignity was often the only luxury left to the cornered. "Inspector, I wrote that letter last week. Martin had discovered certain papers among my late husband's effects, correspondence of a nature that would have caused considerable embarrassment if published. He chose to view this discovery as an opportunity rather than a family burden." "Blackmail," Craddock said with the satisfaction of a man who had found solid ground in a swamp of genteel evasions. "That's a motive with considerable precedent, Lady Kello." Before she could respond, the rectory bell clanged with an urgency that suggested crisis rather than courtesy. Moments later, a young woman swept into the drawing-room with the dramatic flair of one who had learned her entrances in Parisian theatrical circles. Miss Celestine Devereux was undeniably striking, with tempestuous dark hair and eyes that blazed with equal measures of grief and fury. "Where is Martin?" she demanded, her accent carrying the musical precision of educated French. Her gaze swept the room, settling with a gasp of horror on the sheet-covered form. "Mon Dieu, they said he was ill, but—" She collapsed into the nearest chair, her sobs echoing off the vicarage walls with operatic intensity. "Miss Devereux," Craddock said, his professional manner softening slightly in the face of such evident distress. "What is your connection to the deceased?" Through her tears, Celestine explained that she was Martin's fiancée, brought back from Paris with promises of marriage and escape from what she termed this suffocating English propriety. She produced her own letter from Martin, written in his characteristic hasty scrawl. Speaking of desperate love and bitter resentment toward his aunt's control over his inheritance, "She threatened to disinherit him if he married me," Celestine accused, her tear-streaked face turning toward Lady Kello with undisguised hatred. "He was coming here today to defy her, to claim his rightful independence." Dr. Puckridge, who had been observing this emotional display with professional interest, cleared his throat meaningfully. "Inspector, I feel I should mention that the deceased called upon me this morning. He seemed agitated, spoke of needing advice about matters of the heart. When I pressed him for specifics, he mentioned something about continental obligations and debts that couldn't be paid in pounds sterling." This revelation prompted Craddock to examine Martin's other correspondence more carefully. Among his effects were several letters bearing foreign postmarks: Prague, Vienna, and one from a small Bavarian principality known for its association with certain esoteric societies. The contents, though couched in academic language, spoke of initiations, tests of loyalty, and debts that must be paid through demonstration of ultimate commitment. Secret societies, Wimsey observed with the detached interest of a naturalist cataloguing exotic specimens. How very continental, though I confess myself puzzled by the practical applications of ancient wisdom to modern financial difficulties. Lady Kellow's composure, which had remained intact through accusations of blackmail and theatrical grief, showed its first crack of genuine unease. Martin had always possessed what his tutors called an inquiring mind, Inspector. In recent months, however, his inquiries had taken directions that concerned me greatly. These letters speak of powers that modern science was only beginning to understand. Craddock found himself facing not one, but three distinct motives. Lady Kellow's desire to silence a blackmailer, Celestine's potential fury at a broken engagement, and the mysterious continental societies with their talk of ultimate sacrifices. The tea service, when examined, revealed no trace of foreign substances, yet the timing and circumstances suggested something far more complex than simple cardiac failure. "The preserve jar," Wimsey said suddenly, lifting the lid of the crab apple with one finger. "Mrs. Treadgold, this came from Lady Kellow's kitchen, did it not?" "Last Michaelmas," Mrs. Treadgold confirmed, her voice tight with anxiety. "From the parish committee distribution. Though now that I think of it, Mrs. Venn, whose funeral we're mourning today, sent word last night about one of the jars. Said it had gone off, smelled unwholesome. She'd taken one home from the Hobarts after helping with their cleaning." "The Hobarts," Craddock repeated, making careful notes. "And they would be?" "Curiosities and antiquities," Dr. Puckridge supplied grimly. "Jasper Hobart deals in objects of dubious provenance and tales of even more dubious authenticity. The sort of establishment that attracts young men with more imagination than sense." Wimsey had been studying the mantel clock, whose hands remained obstinately 5 minutes slow, despite the afternoon's dramatic events. How curious that time should prove so unreliable in a household dedicated to punctuality. "Tell me, Vicar, was the muffled bell precisely on schedule this afternoon?" The Reverend Treadgold looked hunted. "The bell follows its own counsel, Lord Peter. Vergers, like the rest of us, are subject to human frailty." "Quite so," Wimsey murmured, though his tone suggested that human frailty might prove to be the least reliable witness of all. He glanced once more at Lady Kellow's untouched teacup, its contents grown cold in their porcelain prison, then at Celestine's dramatic pose of grief, and finally at the scattered letters with their talk of continental mysteries and ultimate sacrifices. "Inspector," he said with his most disarming smile, "I believe we have reached that delightful stage in any proper investigation where the evidence has become so abundant that it threatens to obscure the truth entirely. Might I suggest we adjourn to examine Mr. Hobart's establishment? In my experience, curiosity shops often contain the most illuminating answers to questions we hadn't yet thought to ask." As the company prepared to depart, the muffled bell continued its unreasonable liturgy. The French clock declined to advance beyond 4, and the aspidistra stood in silent judgment over a drawing-room where tea had proven considerably more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The widow's teacup remained full, watching the proceedings with the cold eye of porcelain, a witness that had seen everything and would reveal nothing until properly questioned. Outside, the Dorset afternoon continued its sullen performance, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding beneath its grey sky, while somewhere in the village, the truth waited with the patience of a well-trained butler, ready to emerge only when summoned by the proper combination of logic, observation, and that peculiar English genius for detecting murder in the most civilized of circumstances. Hobart's establishment crouched between a fishmonger and a tobacconist, like a scholar who had fallen among tradesmen and decided to make the best of reduced circumstances. The narrow frontage bore a sign in faded gilt proclaiming curiosities and antiquities, though the window display suggested that curiosity had long since triumphed over any pretense to scholarly discrimination. A stuffed owl presided over an eclectic collection that included Tibetan prayer wheels, Roman coins of dubious provenance, and what appeared to be a medieval alchemist's retort, though the brass showed suspicious signs of recent manufacture. Wimsey paused before the door, his monocle catching the grey afternoon light as he examined the shop's facade with the absorbed attention of a connoisseur evaluating a particularly complex vintage. "How delightfully atmospheric," he murmured to Inspector Craddock. "One almost expects to encounter Faustus himself, negotiating the finer points of his contract with appropriate legal counsel." The interior proved even more intriguing than the window suggested. Books in languages both ancient and invented crowded the shelves, while curious instruments of brass and crystal occupied every available surface. The air held that distinctive mixture of old leather, sandalwood, and something indefinably foreign that might have been exotic incense or merely the accumulated mustiness of centuries spent in scholarly pursuit of the improbable. Jasper Hobart emerged from the shop's depths with the measured tread of a man accustomed to dealing with both the credulous and the genuinely learned. He was small and neat, with grey whiskers and wire-rimmed spectacles that suggested academic pursuits, though his eyes held the calculating gleam of one who had learned to price mystery by the ounce. His hands, Wimsey noted with interest, bore the telltale stains of someone who worked regularly with chemicals and dyes, the sort of occupational marks that suggested either genuine alchemical research or a more prosaic involvement in the antiquing of modern objects. "Inspector Craddock," Hobart said with the measured courtesy of one who had dealt with official inquiries before. "And Lord Peter Wimsey. What an unexpected honour. I trust this concerns poor young Martin's unfortunate demise, such a promising student of the esoteric arts, though perhaps too eager to advance beyond his proper station in the great work." "Student?" Craddock inquired, his notebook appearing with practiced efficiency. "Indeed, Inspector. Young Kello had become quite fascinated with certain continental traditions, the pursuit of knowledge that transcends conventional academic boundaries. He was particularly drawn to the Germanic schools of mystical philosophy, though I fear his enthusiasm occasionally exceeded his discretion." Hobart's tone suggested the fond exasperation of a tutor dealing with an overeager. Pupil Wimsey had drifted toward a collection of timepieces arranged on a side table, pocket watches, a small carriage clock, and what appeared to be a medieval water clock, though its brass fittings gleamed with suspicious newness. "How fascinating that the pursuit of timeless wisdom should require such temporal precision," he observed, lifting a pocket watch and examining its face. "This particular specimen appears to have stopped at 23 minutes past 3. A significant moment, perhaps, or merely the result of neglected winding." "Ah, you have an eye for the symbolic, Lord Peter," Hobart replied with evident pleasure. "That watch belonged to a Rosicrucian adept from Prague. It is said to have stopped at the precise moment of his transcendence to a higher plane of existence. Though between ourselves," he added with a conspiratorial whisper, "the mainspring may simply require attention." Craddock, who preferred his mysteries grounded in observable fact, cleared his throat meaningfully. "Mr. Hobart, we understand that young Martin was a regular customer. What exactly did he purchase from you?" Hobart moved to a leather-bound ledger and consulted it with the precision of a clerk recording sacred transactions. "Let me see. Most recently a length of crimson silk cord, Italian work recovered from a dismantled monastery near Ravenna. Also a small glass vessel, Venetian rope twist, though regrettably lacking its original stopper. Young Martin seemed particularly amused by its fragility." "A cord and a bottle," Craddock repeated, making careful notes. "And the purpose of these items?" "The cord was for binding, not in any crude physical sense, you understand, but as a symbol of commitment to the great work. The vessel was to contain a preparation he had requested, a teacup, compound mentioned in certain classical texts as facilitating heightened states of consciousness. Wimsey had discovered a collection of bell clappers hanging from a beam, their leather ties cracked with age. He examined them with the absorbed attention of a musician, evaluating the tonal qualities of a particularly fine instrument. "I use stock ecclesiastical fittings, Mr. Hobart. An unusual sideline for a purveyor of mystical wisdom. The Church, Lord Peter, has always been a repository of ancient knowledge, though it has not always recognized the full significance of its treasures. These came from St. Winifred's, when they modernized their bell tower in 1897. Leather perishes, even in holy places, but the bronze endures." "Indeed," Wimsey murmured. noting how the leather mufflers showed signs of recent handling despite their apparent age. "And do you supply similar services to our local parish? I noticed the muffled bell this afternoon had a particularly distinctive tone." Hobart's scholarly composure showed the first signs of unease. "I may have provided certain materials to assist with funeral arrangements. The proper observance of mourning requires appropriate equipment, and modern suppliers often lack appreciation for traditional methods." Dr. Puckridge, who had been examining a collection of dried herbs with professional interest, looked up sharply. "Mr. Hobart, some of these specimens would be considered dangerous in amateur hands. This particular root, for instance," he indicated a gnarled specimen in a glass jar, "contains alkaloids that affect cardiac function. In sufficient quantity, it would produce symptoms virtually indistinguishable from natural heart failure." "Ah, you refer to the digitalis family," Hobart replied with the satisfaction of a teacher whose student had finally grasped a difficult concept. "The ancients understood well the dual nature of such gifts from the earth, healing in small doses, transcendence in larger ones. Young Martin was particularly interested in preparations that would facilitate what he called the final demonstration of commitment. Wimsey had discovered a small aneroid barometer, whose needle quivered uncertainly between change and fair. He tapped the glass lightly, watching the needle settle with obvious reluctance. "How curious that even scientific instruments should prove so indecisive in your establishment. Mr. Hobart," rather like witnesses at an inquest, everyone pointing in different directions. Before Hobart could respond, the shop's bell announced another visitor. Mrs. Bunting, the vicarage cook, entered with the determined air of one who had come to settle accounts. She was followed by a nervous young man whose ink-stained fingers and apologetic manner suggested clerical employment of the more mundane variety. "Mr. Hobart," Mrs. Bunting announced without preamble, "I've come about that preserve jar from the parish committee distribution, the one that went to poor Mrs. Venn before her passing. She sent word yesterday that it had gone off, said it smelled of bitter almonds and foreign spices, nothing like proper crabapple preserve." The nervous young man stepped forward with an apologetic cough. "Begging your pardon, I'm Pritchard from Messrs. Crenshaw and Associates. Mrs. Venn engaged our services last week to investigate certain irregularities she'd noticed. She suspected someone had been tampering with the parish preserves, replacing proper English jam with substances of unknown origin." Wimsey's eyebrow rose with the delicate precision of a conductor acknowledging a particularly well-timed entrance. "How very thorough of the late Mrs. Venn. And did your investigation yield illuminating results, Mr. Pritchard?" "Indeed, sir. Mrs. Venn had purchased what she believed to be a standard jar for the parish committee from this establishment. However, she became suspicious when the contents proved unusual in both aroma and consistency." Hobart's scholarly composure began to show definite cracks. "The old woman was impossibly suspicious. She demanded explanations for perfectly legitimate transactions, threatened to involve the authorities over what was clearly a misunderstanding about the nature of preserved fruits." Craddock looked up from his notebook with the expression of a man who sensed solid ground beneath his feet. "Mr. Hobart, are you saying you provided altered preserves to the parish committee, preserves that might have been consumed by unsuspecting parishioners?" "I merely provided what young Martin requested," Hobart protested, his academic dignity beginning to fray around the edges. "A preparation that would serve his particular requirements, a compound that would facilitate his participation in certain continental traditions requiring demonstration of absolute commitment. Poison disguised as jam," Craddock said with the satisfaction of a man who had finally reached familiar territory. "And young Martin was to consume this during his regular Tuesday tea at the vicarage, thereby providing his foreign associates with the dramatic demonstration they required." Wimsey had been studying a small collection of measuring instruments with renewed attention. "How fascinating that spiritual transcendence should require such precise dosages, Mr. Hobart. Tell me, did young Martin's continental correspondence specify the exact timing of this demonstration, the precise location perhaps, and the identity of the witnesses who would authenticate the proceedings?" The question struck home with visible effect. Hobart's face went pale as he realized the implications of Wimsey's seemingly casual inquiry. They required proof of his dedication, witnesses of unimpeachable character. The ceremony was to take place in surroundings that would enhance the spiritual significance of the moment. A vicarage, Dr. Puckridge said grimly, with a vicar, a respected widow, and visiting nobility as witnesses. How very convenient for authenticating what would appear to be a natural death occurring in the most respectable of circumstances. Lady Kellow, who had maintained her composure throughout these revelations, spoke for the first time since entering the shop. "Inspector, I believe we now understand why my nephew was so confident about defying my threats regarding his blackmail scheme. He never intended to survive long enough to face the consequences of his actions." Craddock closed his notebook with the decisive snap of a case approaching resolution. "Mr. Hobart, I believe we'll need to examine your entire stock of preserved goods, along with any correspondence you may have had with Continental associates regarding young Martin's spiritual development." As they prepared to conduct a thorough search of the premises, Wimsey remained behind to examine the shop's curious inventory more carefully. Among the timepieces, he noted several that had stopped at different hours, as if time itself had become unreliable in Hobart's presence. The bell clappers showed signs of recent use, despite their apparent antiquity, and the collection of measuring instruments suggested someone with a keen interest in precise dosages and careful timing. "How very systematic," he murmured to himself, to reduce transcendence to a matter of proper scheduling and appropriate witnesses. Though I confess myself impressed by the theatrical sophistication using the parish committee's preserved distribution as a delivery method shows genuine criminal imagination. Yet, even as the case against Hobart appeared to solidify, Wimsey found himself troubled by certain inconsistencies that seemed to dance just beyond the edge of comprehension. The widow's teacup remained full. The French clock continued its 5-minute deception, and somewhere in the orderly chaos of English village life, truth waited with the patience of a well-trained butler, ready to reveal its secrets only when summoned by the proper combination of logic, observation, and that peculiar English genius for detecting deception in the most civilized of circumstances. The game, as Wimsey reflected with quiet satisfaction, was proving far more complex than even the continental societies had suspected. For while ancient wisdom might speak of transcendence and spiritual commitment, the truth of young Martin's death lay not in mystical preparations, but in the precise mechanics of a very English murder, conducted with all the punctuality and attention to detail that characterized the best domestic arrangements. The morning returned to Dorset, with that peculiar combination of watery sunlight and persistent drizzle that seemed designed to remind one that English weather, like English murder, rarely conformed to continental expectations. Wimsey presented himself at the vicarage at precisely 9 o'clock, his pocket watch gleaming with the sort of chronometric authority that suggested he intended to wage war against temporal imprecision. Mrs. Treadgold admitted him with the expression of one who had spent a sleepless night contemplating the fragility of domestic routine in the face of sudden death. "Inspector Craddock was here at 8, my lord," she reported with the precision of a military dispatch, measuring things and asking about yesterday's exact timing. "He said you might wish to reconstruct the proceedings." "An admirable inspector," Wimsey replied, settling his watch upon the mantelpiece beside the recalcitrant French clock, which maintained its stubborn 5-minute deception with the persistence of a theological argument. "Chronology, Mrs. Treadgold, is the most unforgiving of mistresses. She tolerates neither approximation nor sentiment, and she has a particularly vindictive attitude toward those who attempt to deceive her." He positioned himself in Martin's customary chair by the French windows, noting the precise angle from which the young man would have reached for the crabapple preserve. "Now then, if you would be so kind as to demonstrate yesterday's ritual with mathematical precision, at what exact moment do you begin the sacred rites of afternoon tea?" Mrs. Treadgold assumed her position behind the tea service with renewed authority, clearly gratified to have her domestic expertise recognized by someone of quality. "The kettle begins to sing at 8 minutes past 3, my lord. I pour the boiling water at 12 minutes past. Allow it to steep until 15 minutes past, and serve precisely as the clock chimes the quarter hour." Wimsey consulted his watch with the attention of an astronomer calculating celestial mechanics. "Proceed, if you please." The household machinery obeyed its established liturgy. The kettle announced its readiness at what Mrs. Treadgold confidently declared to be 8 minutes past 3, though Wimsey's timepiece indicated 13 minutes past. He walked to the hall where the grandfather clock showed 11 minutes past, then stepped outside to listen for the church bell. Through the grey air came the muffled stroke, ambiguous, delayed, carrying on the wind like a message from a more uncertain world. "Most illuminating," he murmured, returning as the tea was poured. "Mrs. Treadgold, yesterday you mentioned that the clock chimed 3 precisely as you began to serve. Yet your clock chimed at 10 minutes past the actual hour. Your domestic routine, therefore, has been operating 5 minutes in arrear. A charming example of temporal democracy, where each timepiece votes according to its own constitutional principles." He lifted the jam spoon, noting the faint opalescent residue near the bowl that caught the morning light like a confession waiting to be heard. "And this preserve jar, when exactly was it placed upon the table?" "2:50 by our clock, sir," Elsie volunteered from the doorway, her voice carrying the defensive precision of one whose competence had been questioned. "I set everything proper-like, then left twice, once to tell cook about the milk, and once to fetch the vicar's devotional that Mrs. Venn had returned with her note about the preserves." Wimsey examined the jar's paper cover, noting a small puncture where something sharp had penetrated. The contents smelled of nothing more sinister than autumn orchards and crystallized sugar. Yet something in the arrangement troubled him. The positioning, the timing, the careful choreography of a domestic routine that had been performed with suspicious precision. "From the kitchen to this room," he observed, pacing the distance with measured steps, "requires precisely 27 steps for Elsie, 19 for myself, and perhaps 23 for someone of Martin's height and build." The window remained half open throughout, creating a draught that would carry sounds from the garden and church, most convenient for monitoring the progress of external events. His investigation extended beyond the vicarage walls. At the post office, Miss Price's ledger revealed that Dr. Puckridge had been summoned at 3:24, yet Mrs. Legg at the grocer's had observed him driving past the town hall at 3:23. "Anticipatory medicine," Wimsey observed with mild approval. "The good doctor appears to have developed the useful ability to respond to calls before they are placed. The church yielded its own temporal mysteries. The verger, Mr. Bligh, confirmed that he had tolled the muffled bell at precisely 3 o'clock for Mrs. Venn's funeral. Yet the leather muffler showed signs of recent adjustment. Mr. Hobart provided new strapping, Bligh explained with the satisfaction of one whose equipment had received professional attention. Said the old leather would perish without proper care. When Wimsey tested the bell's acoustic properties, he discovered that the muffled stroke, when carried on the prevailing wind, arrived at the vicarage garden with a curious delay and distortion that could easily be mistaken for a quarter-hour chime, rather than the hour itself. "Most ingenious," he murmured. "Even time itself becomes unreliable when properly manipulated." His final stop was Lady Kellow's establishment, where he discovered that her ladyship maintained her own dairy cow and delivered fresh milk personally each morning, a detail that cast interesting light on her movements and opportunities. More significantly, her morning routine included a constitutional walk that would have taken her past both Hobart's shop and the vicarage during the crucial hours before yesterday's tragedy. Returning to the vicarage, Wimsey found Inspector Craddock armed with a comprehensive collection of evidence from Hobart's establishment: the incriminating journal, correspondence with Continental associates, and detailed records of what appeared to be an international network of mystical suicide demonstrations. 23 previous cases, all following the same pattern of wealthy young men seeking transcendence through carefully orchestrated public deaths. Quite overwhelming in its thoroughness, Wimsey observed, examining the documentation with the detached interest of a scholar reviewing a particularly elaborate forgery. One might almost suspect that Mr. Hobart has been uncommonly helpful in providing exactly the sort of evidence that would satisfy any reasonable investigation into young Martin's demise. He moved to the aspidistra, where something glinted among the leaves, a single thread of crimson silk, fine as a hair and nearly invisible against the dark foliage. "The cord that Mr. Hobart mentioned selling to Martin," he said, lifting it carefully. Curious that it should find its way here, when the young man was supposedly engaged in consuming poisoned preserves rather than binding ceremonies. Craddock frowned at this development. Perhaps he brought it with him, intending it for some part of his ritual suicide. Perhaps, Wimsey agreed, though his tone suggested considerable skepticism. Yet I find myself troubled by the choreography of yesterday's events. Consider, Mrs. Venn complains about suspicious preserves on Monday evening and dies Tuesday morning. Her funeral is scheduled for Tuesday afternoon, with muffled bells beginning at 3 o'clock. Martin arrives early for an appointment scheduled after 3:30, consumes the fatal preserve at 3:15, and collapses at 3:20, precisely as the funeral bell reaches its most resonant period. He consulted his watch with the precision of a conductor preparing for a complex musical passage. The timing is too perfect, Inspector. Too theatrical. Too convenient. When a murder is staged to look like suicide, one expects a certain amount of dramatic license. But when every element of the performance, the witnesses, the setting, the background music, has been arranged with such meticulous attention to detail, one begins to suspect that the real purpose lies not in the death itself, but in ensuring that the death appears to occur under precisely these circumstances. The silence that followed this observation was broken only by the persistent tick of Wimsey's pocket watch and the distant, muffled complaint of the church bell, still tolling for Mrs. Venn's interrupted rest. The French clock on the mantelpiece maintained its stubborn 5-minute deception, a silent witness to the temporal manipulations that had made yesterday's tragedy possible. "The widow's teacup remains full," Wimsey said finally, his gaze resting on Lady Kello, with the sort of polite attention one might give to a particularly interesting specimen in a natural history museum. "And I begin to suspect that the reasons for its remaining so are considerably more complex than any continental conspiracy would suggest. The game, Inspector, has been played with remarkable skill, but the rules, I fear, are entirely English." As the morning advanced toward another afternoon tea service, Wimsey found himself contemplating the precise mechanics of a murder that had been disguised not merely as suicide, but as the sort of exotic suicide that would satisfy both police investigators and continental mystics. The truth, he reflected, lay not in the elaborate documentation of international conspiracies, but in the careful manipulation of domestic routine, the sort of quintessentially English crime that could only be committed by someone with intimate knowledge of village life, parish schedules, and the reliable unreliability of Dorset timekeeping. The bell continued its mournful commentary on the morning's revelations, while somewhere in the ordered chaos of English village life, a murderer waited with the confidence of one who had constructed the perfect alibi from the very evidence that would eventually destroy it. The morning had dawned with that particular combination of watery sunlight and persistent uncertainty that seemed to mirror the investigation itself, promising clarity while delivering only additional complications. Wimsey had established himself in the vicarage study, surrounded by parish registers, household accounts, and the accumulated detritus of what was proving to be a remarkably complex domestic conspiracy. "Inspector," he announced as Craddock arrived with his customary collection of official papers and barely suppressed exasperation. "I believe we have reached that delightful stage in any proper investigation where the evidence has become so abundant that we must begin the delicate process of separating theatrical performance from genuine motivation." He gestured toward a neat arrangement of documents spread across the vicar's desk-like cards in an elaborate game of patience. "Our continental correspondence, for instance, proves most illuminating when examined alongside certain domestic records. Young Martin, it appears, has been leading not merely a double life, but a triple one, each identity carefully crafted to serve specific purposes. The first revelation emerged from Wimsey's visit to the Crown and Anchor, where Miss Celestine Devereux had been installed with all the dramatic flair appropriate to a continental tragedy. However, closer examination of her credentials revealed a rather more prosaic origin than her passionate French accent suggested. "Miss Devereux," Wimsey explained with evident satisfaction, "for that is her actual name, was engaged through Carter and Pease's Superior Ladies for Superior Occasions at the rate of £3 weekly plus expenses. Her continental romance was as manufactured as her accent, though I must commend her theatrical abilities. She performed her role with considerable conviction. The young woman's confession, once her identity was established, revealed the methodical nature of Martin's planning. He had provided her with carefully crafted letters to copy, specific instructions about timing and emotional display, and detailed coaching in the sort of continental sophistication that would either melt his aunt's heart or inflame her prejudices sufficiently to provoke a definitive response. The beauty of the scheme, Wimsey observed, lay in its flexibility. Whether Lady Kellow chose to disinherit him publicly or pay for his silence privately, Martin would achieve his immediate objective, though I suspect his ultimate goals were rather more complex than simple financial gain. Craddock's investigation of Crenshaw and Associates had yielded equally intriguing results. Martin had engaged the firm 6 weeks previously under the assumed name of Raven, a choice that suggested both literary pretension and a certain grim humor about his ultimate intentions. His ostensible purpose was to compile evidence against fraudulent occultists for a London periodical, though his particular interest in funeral customs and bell-muffling techniques suggested more practical applications. Mr. Pritchard's records indicate that Martin paid his retainer from Lady Kellow's banking account, Wimsey noted, examining the relevant documentation with the absorbed attention of a scholar studying ancient manuscripts. The signature M.K. was sufficiently ambiguous to pass casual scrutiny, though it suggests our young friend had developed considerable skill in the manipulation of family financial arrangements. The chronological analysis proved even more revealing. Wimsey had spent the morning reconstructing the precise timing of yesterday's events, consulting multiple timepieces, and interviewing witnesses with the methodical precision of an astronomer calculating celestial mechanics. The results painted a picture of carefully orchestrated confusion, designed to obscure the true sequence of events. The vicarage clock runs 5 minutes slow, he explained, positioning his own timepiece beside the recalcitrant French mechanism. Mrs. Treadgold's domestic routine operates according to this delayed chronology, creating a window of temporal uncertainty that proves most convenient for anyone wishing to manipulate the apparent timing of significant events. The muffled funeral bell added another layer of acoustic deception. When carried on the prevailing wind, its distorted tone could easily be mistaken for the quarter-hour chime, further complicating any attempt to establish precise timing. The leather mufflers, recently supplied by Hobart, showed signs of deliberate adjustment to enhance this effect. Even time itself becomes unreliable, Wimsey murmured, when properly manipulated by someone with intimate knowledge of local customs and mechanical peculiarities. His examination of the physical evidence yielded additional insights. The silver salver bearing Lady Kellow's initial had been present in the drawing-room, despite her ladyship's absence from recent social gatherings. Faint traces of crystalline residue suggested recent use, though for what purpose remained tantalizingly unclear. The preserve jar itself told a more complex story than initial examination had suggested. While the contents showed no trace of foreign substances, the paper cover bore a small puncture mark where something sharp had penetrated. The positioning of the jar on the tea table, combined with the established ritual of service, created multiple opportunities for intervention by anyone familiar with the household routine. Mrs. Venn's complaint about suspicious preserves, Wimsey observed, arrived with remarkably convenient timing. Her death yesterday morning provided both the muffled bell and the atmosphere of solemnity. That served as acoustic camouflage for our domestic tragedy. Dr. Puckridge's medical records revealed that Martin had indeed consulted him about cardiac irregularities, though the young man's symptoms appeared to be more psychological than physiological in origin. The prescribed digitalis provided a legitimate medical explanation for the presence of cardiac medications in Martin's possession, though the dosages recorded suggested careful attention to therapeutic rather than lethal quantities. Lady Kellow's morning constitutional had taken her past both Hobart's establishment and the vicarage during the crucial period when final arrangements were being completed. Her conversation with the antiquarian, according to witnesses, had involved the purchase of a small package wrapped in brown paper, contents unknown, but timing highly suggestive. The Continental correspondence speaks not of mystical transcendence, Wimsey explained, but of intelligence networks, and the sort of information that becomes valuable during periods of international uncertainty. Martin's educational sojourn appears to have been rather more educational than anyone anticipated. The investigation had also revealed the true nature of Sir Lionel's wartime activities. The embarrassing papers that Martin had discovered related not merely to personal indiscretions, but to financial arrangements that might have proved catastrophic if subjected to official scrutiny. The blackmail scheme was merely the opening gambit in a more complex game involving multiple players and competing interests. We are dealing, Wimsey concluded, with a young man who possessed considerable intelligence, unlimited ambition, and a fatal tendency to underestimate the sophistication of his opponents. His double life, investigative journalist and continental mystic, was designed to provide multiple escape routes from an increasingly complex situation. Yet even as the various deceptions unraveled, certain fundamental questions remained unanswered. The precise mechanism of Martin's death, the identity of his killer, and the ultimate purpose behind the elaborate theatrical framework continued to elude definitive explanation. "The widow's teacup remains full," Wimsey observed, glancing toward Lady Kello with the sort of polite attention one might accord a particularly interesting specimen in a natural history museum. "And I begin to suspect that the reasons for its remaining so are considerably more complex than any continental conspiracy would suggest." As the afternoon advanced toward another potential tea service, Wimsey found himself contemplating the precise mechanics of a murder that had been disguised not merely as suicide, but as the sort of exotic suicide that would satisfy multiple audiences simultaneously. The truth, he reflected, lay not in the elaborate documentation of international conspiracies, but in the careful manipulation of domestic routine, the sort of quintessentially English crime that could only be committed by someone with intimate knowledge of village life, parish schedules, and the reliable unreliability of Dorset timekeeping. The game was approaching its critical phase, though the final moves remained to be played. Somewhere in the ordered chaos of English village life, a murderer waited with the confidence of one who had constructed the perfect alibi from the very evidence that would eventually destroy it. The double life, Wimsey suspected, belonged not to the victim but to the killer, and the truth, when finally revealed, would prove far more shocking than any continental mystery could provide. The bell continued its mournful commentary on the morning's revelations, while time itself maintained its stubborn refusal to conform to human expectations of precision and reliability. In the peculiar mathematics of English murder, Wimsey reflected, even the most carefully calculated schemes were subject to the unpredictable variables of human nature and the inexorable logic of truth. The morning had settled into that peculiar state of suspended animation that follows significant revelations, like the moment after a thunderclap when even the most stolid country furniture seems to hold its breath. Wimsey had positioned himself before the vicarage mantelpiece with the methodical precision of a scholar preparing to dissect a particularly complex manuscript, though his attention was fixed not upon literary criticism, but upon a small, tarnished silver salver that bore the engraved initial K. Mrs. Treadgold. He announced with the casual authority of one accustomed to having domestic mysteries yield their secrets upon proper interrogation. "I find myself intrigued by this charming piece of silver. Lady Kello's salver, I presume, yet yesterday she was not expected for tea. How curious that it should find itself present at our tragic little drama." Mrs. Treadgold, who had been hovering with the protective anxiety of one whose household arrangements had been subjected to official scrutiny, brightened with the satisfaction of providing useful information. "Oh, that's for her ladyship's morning milk delivery, Lord Peter. She brings it herself, you know, from her own dairy cow. Most particular about freshness, she is. Calls every morning at 9:30, regular as the church bell." Wimsey's monocle caught the grey morning light as he examined the salver with renewed interest. "Every morning at 9:30, he repeated thoughtfully. "And yesterday, Mrs. Treadgold, was Lady Kello punctual in her dairy devotions?" A faint flush of uncertainty crossed the good woman's features. "Well, not precisely punctual, my lord. She was delayed. Nearly 10 o'clock, I should think. Said something about a troublesome gate latch. Most unlike her ladyship, who's usually as regular as clockwork. And she seemed rather flustered. Left the salver on the mantelpiece, saying she'd collect it later as she was in such a hurry." Inspector Craddock, who had been observing this domestic archaeology, with the patient attention of one who had learned that Lord Peter's seemingly casual inquiries often yielded unexpected treasures, leaned forward with sharpened interest. 10 o'clock, you say? That would place Lady Kello in the drawing-room well after the Morning Post, but before the tea preparations began. Precisely, Wimsey murmured, producing a small magnifying glass and examining the salver's surface with the absorbed attention of a jeweller evaluating a suspicious diamond. "And what have we here? Mrs. Treadgold, this residue along the rim, surely not the result of innocent dairy transactions?" He scraped a minute quantity of crystalline material from the silver's edge, holding it up to catch the watery light. "Most illuminating. This is neither milk residue nor common sugar, but something rather more sophisticated. Something that would leave precisely this sort of trace when applied in liquid form and allowed to dry." Dr. Puckridge, who had arrived with his customary combination of professional efficiency and barely concealed curiosity, examined the sample with practiced attention. "Digitalis preparation, I should say. The crystalline formation is characteristic of the glycoside when concentrated. In sufficient quantity, it would produce rapid cardiac symptoms virtually indistinguishable from natural heart failure." Wimsey nodded with the satisfaction of one whose theoretical framework was receiving practical confirmation. "The beauty of the scheme, Inspector, lay in its elegant simplicity. Lady Kello possessed 3 crucial advantages: intimate knowledge of the household routine, legitimate access to the drawing-room during the critical period, and complete awareness of Martin's own theatrical intentions." He moved to the tea table, where yesterday's tragic drama had unfolded with such carefully orchestrated precision. Consider the sequence. Martin had confided his elaborate suicide deception to his aunt, complete with the timing, the witnesses, and the intended method. He required her financial cooperation and her silence. She provided both, along with a rather more permanent solution to her blackmail difficulties. Craddock's notebook appeared with practiced efficiency. "You're suggesting Lady Kello knew about Martin's fake suicide scheme and used it to commit actual murder?" "I am suggesting," Wimsey replied with the precision of a mathematician demonstrating a particularly elegant proof, "that Lady Kello transformed Martin's theatrical deception into genuine tragedy through the simple expedient of substitution. The morning milk delivery provided perfect cover for introducing a lethal preparation into what Martin believed would be his harmless stage poison." He lifted the preserve jar, noting again the small puncture in its paper cover. Martin had arranged with Hobart for a non-lethal preparation, something that would produce dramatic symptoms without permanent consequences. The glass vessel, the crimson cord, the continental correspondence, all genuine elements in an elaborate performance designed to satisfy his foreign associates, while allowing him to vanish with Lady Kello's money. Mrs. Treadgold's face had grown pale with dawning comprehension. "You mean he was going to pretend to die? Here in my drawing-room?" "Indeed," Wimsey confirmed gently. The muffled funeral bell provided atmospheric authenticity. The 5-minute clock discrepancy created temporal confusion, and the assembled witnesses, vicar, widow, visiting nobility, would provide unimpeachable testimony to what appeared to be natural death occurring in the most respectable circumstances. He returned his attention to the silver salver, where the telltale residue gleamed like evidence of a confession. Lady Kello's morning visit allowed her to introduce a genuine cardiac poison into Martin's carefully prepared stage properties. When he consumed what he believed to be his harmless theatrical preparation, he received instead a lethal dose of concentrated digitalis, obtained, I suspect, from Dr. Puckridge's own dispensary during one of her visits regarding Martin's supposed cardiac irregularities. Dr. Puckridge shifted uncomfortably. Lady Kello did inquire about Martin's medication, said she wanted to ensure proper dosages during his visits. I may have been overly helpful in explaining the therapeutic applications of cardiac glycosides. The widow's teacup remained full, Wimsey observed, glancing toward the porcelain evidence that had first alerted him to the deception's true nature. Because Lady Kellow had no need to participate in Martin's performance. She had already served her own, far more potent brew. The superstitions about funeral observances provided perfect cover for her abstinence from refreshments she knew to be harmless. The morning light, filtering through the French windows with the persistent uncertainty of English weather, illuminated a drawing room where domestic routine had been perverted into an instrument of murder. The French clock maintained its stubborn 5-minute deception, while somewhere in the village, the truth waited with the patience of a well-trained butler, ready to emerge fully only when summoned by the proper combination of evidence, logic, and that peculiar English genius for detecting calculated malice beneath the most civilized of circumstances. "Inspector," Wimsey concluded with his most disarming smile, "I believe we have reached that stage in our investigation where theory must yield to practical demonstration. Might I suggest we invite Lady Kellow to collect her forgotten salver? In my experience, murderers often display a touching attachment to the instruments of their success and a fatal tendency to return for overlooked evidence." As Craddock prepared to issue the necessary summons, the church bell tolled the hour with renewed authority, its muffled complaint now sounding less like mourning and more like a warning. The game was approaching its final moves, though the most dramatic revelations remained to be played. Out in the drawing room where English murder had been, committed with all the punctuality and attention to detail that characterized the finest domestic arrangements, the widow's teacup, still full and growing cold in its porcelain prison, stood as silent testimony to the peculiar mathematics of village crime, where even the most carefully calculated schemes remained subject to the unpredictable variables of human observation, and the inexorable logic of justice, served with appropriate ceremony and precisely the right amount of milk. The afternoon had assumed that peculiar quality of suspended animation that precedes the final act of a well-constructed drama, though in this case the stage was a vicarage drawing room, and the audience consisted of Inspector Craddock, Dr. Puckridge, and the assembled household staff, all arranged with the careful precision of players awaiting their cues. Wimsey had spent the morning in what he termed theatrical preparation, though his activities bore more resemblance to the methodical arrangements of a prosecuting counsel than the casual diversions of an amateur detective. Mrs. Treadgold had restored the drawing room to its exact configuration from yesterday's tragedy, down to the precise angle of the aspidistra and the stubborn 5-minute deception maintained by the French clock. The tea service gleamed with fresh polish, though the atmosphere carried none of yesterday's domestic tranquility. Instead, the room hummed with expectation, like a concert hall in the moments before the conductor's entrance. Lady Kellow arrived with punctual dignity, her black silk rustling with the authority of one accustomed to having domestic arrangements conform to her expectations. She paused in the doorway, surveying the assembled company with the calculating precision of a general assessing a battlefield, before settling her gaze upon Wimsey with polite inquiry. "Lord Peter," she began, her voice carrying its customary note of aristocratic composure, "Mrs. Treadgold mentioned that you wished to discuss my forgotten salver. I trust this theatrical gathering serves some purpose beyond satisfying your evident taste for dramatic presentation." Wimsey, who had positioned himself beside the mantelpiece with the casual authority of a host welcoming guests to his own drawing room, smiled with genuine warmth. "Indeed, Lady Kellow. We are engaged in what I believe the theatrical profession calls a reconstruction, though our purpose is illumination rather than entertainment. Pray do collect your salver. It has been waiting with admirable patience for your return." She moved toward the mantelpiece with unhurried grace, her gloved hand reaching for the silver piece that bore her engraved initial. As her fingers touched the tarnished surface, Wimsey produced a small magnifying glass and a folded photograph from his waistcoat pocket. "Before you depart with your property," he said with apologetic courtesy, "might I direct your attention to this rather curious detail?" He indicated the photograph, which showed the salver's rim bearing a faint but unmistakable crystalline residue. "Dr. Puckridge has been most helpful in identifying this substance. Perhaps you would care to share your professional opinion, Doctor." Dr. Puckridge stepped forward with the measured authority of medical expertise. The residue is concentrated digitalis, Lord Peter, cardiac glycoside in sufficient quantity to prove rapidly fatal. The crystalline formation suggests it was applied in liquid form and allowed to dry. Lady Kellow's composure, which had survived yesterday's accusations of blackmail and suggestions of continental conspiracy, showed its first hairline crack. "I fail to see how this concerns me, Lord Peter. Surely you don't suggest that I had anything to do with such a preparation?" "On the contrary," Wimsey replied, his tone remaining conversational despite the gravity of his words, "I suggest that you had everything to do with it. You see, Lady Kellow, young Martin had made the fatal error of confiding his elaborate deception to the one person who possessed both the means and the motive to transform theatrical suicide into genuine, a murder." He moved to the preserve jar, lifting it with the delicate precision of a scholar handling ancient manuscripts. Martin's scheme was admirably thorough: the continental correspondence, the mystical suicide pact, the carefully timed collapse before impeccable witnesses. He had even arranged with Mr. Hobart for a harmless preparation that would produce dramatic symptoms without permanent consequences. The perfect disappearing act, complete with death certificate and grieving relatives. Lady Kellow's eyes had grown cold and watchful, though she maintained her position beside the mantelpiece with regal dignity. "You speak in riddles, Lord Peter. Martin collapsed from natural causes, a weak heart, as Dr. Puckridge confirmed." "Indeed, he did collapse," Wimsey agreed pleasantly, "though the weakness in question proved to be not cardiac, but tactical. Martin's error lay in trusting family loyalty above criminal opportunity. Your morning milk delivery, Lady Kellow, provided perfect cover for the substitution that transformed his harmless stage poison into genuine cardiac arrest." He indicated the small puncture in the preserve jar's paper cover, barely visible unless one knew where to look. "The beauty of your method lay in its elegant simplicity. While Martin believed he was consuming his theatrical preparation, he was actually ingesting a lethal dose of digitalis, introduced through this tiny opening during your morning visit. The salver, ostensibly brought for milk delivery, served as your convenient mixing vessel." Inspector Craddock, who had been following this exposition with professional attention, stepped forward with his notebook at the ready. "Lady Kellow, these are serious allegations. Do you have any response to Lord Peter's accusations?" Lady Kellow straightened her shoulders with the dignity of one who had been outmaneuvered, but refused to surrender without appropriate ceremony. "Martin was destroying himself with those foreign influences and modern ideas," she said, her voice carrying the flat certainty of absolute conviction. "The blackmail was merely the beginning. He would have continued demanding money, threatening exposure, dragging the family name through increasingly sordid scandals. I acted to preserve something larger than individual lives." "You acted," Craddock replied with the authority of official judgment, "to commit murder. The motive is clear: financial gain and family reputation. The opportunity was provided by your regular morning visits. The method has been demonstrated through physical evidence." He consulted his notebook with professional thoroughness. "Lady Kellow, I must ask you to accompany me for formal questioning regarding the murder of your nephew." Wimsey had moved to the tea table, where Lady Kellow's cup remained precisely as she had left it yesterday, full, untouched and now eloquently accusatory. "The widow's teacup," he observed with quiet satisfaction, "remained full because you knew the preserve was poisoned. Your superstitious refusal to drink during funeral observances was merely convenient camouflage for knowledge you shouldn't have possessed." As the machinery of justice began its measured progression, Lady Kellow maintained her composure with the sort of aristocratic dignity that suggested she viewed arrest as merely another social inconvenience to be endured with appropriate grace. The drawing-room, which had witnessed yesterday's carefully orchestrated tragedy, now hosted the revelation of its true nature: not continental mysticism, but thoroughly English murder, committed with all the punctuality and attention to detail that characterized the finest domestic arrangements. The French clock chimed 4 with its customary 5-minute delay, while outside the window, Dorset afternoon light continued its persistent struggle with gathering clouds. The aspidistra stood in silent judgment over a scene where family loyalty had been perverted into an instrument of murder, then exposed again through the precise application of observation, logic, and that peculiar English genius for detecting calculated malice beneath the most civilized of circumstances. The game, Wimsey murmured to himself as the official party prepared to depart, has been played with remarkable skill, though I confess myself unsurprised by the outcome. In my experience, the most dangerous conspiracies are invariably domestic ones, and the most lethal poisons are those served with the morning milk by loving relatives who have calculated the precise value of family affection. The widow's teacup, no longer full but finally empty of its secrets, bore witness to the resolution of a case where nothing had been quite what it seemed, and where the most elaborate continental mysteries had proved to be merely theatrical decoration for a thoroughly recognizably and lethally English crime. The drawing-room had assumed that peculiar quality of suspended expectation that precedes the final movement of a well-orchestrated symphony, though in this case the conductor wielded logic rather than a baton, and the audience consisted of those who had unwittingly participated in a performance far more sinister than any of them had suspected. Inspector Craddock had reached for his warrant card, when Wimsey, with that negligent elegance which made interruption appear a form of courtesy, lifted one finger. "One moment, Inspector. We have achieved moral certainty, which is admirable, but I confess myself reluctant to conclude without providing a trifle of mechanical illustration. Lady Kellow has been most cooperative in her confession, but the method deserves proper demonstration, if only to satisfy my own pedantic nature." Lady Kellow's gaze, frosted to an aristocratic sheen that could have preserved fruit for decades, did not waver. "If we must indulge in theatricals, Lord Peter, pray be swift. I have never admired lengthy curtain calls, and I suspect Inspector Craddock's patience has its limits." "Indeed," Wimsey agreed amiably, moving to the tea-table with the purposeful stride of a lecturer approaching his demonstration apparatus. "Mrs. Treadgold, might I trouble you for a clean preserve jar, a length of fine thread, scarlet silk if you have it, though any strong fibre will serve our pedagogical purposes, and perhaps a hat-pin of the sort sold at tobacconists for 2d halfpenny." The requested items appeared with that efficiency which characterized Mrs. Treadgold's domestic arrangements, though her hands trembled slightly as she provided them. Wimsey positioned Lady Kellow's silver salver in the center of the tea-table, placed the empty jar upon it, and examined the paper cover with the absorbed attention of a scholar preparing to reveal ancient secrets. "You observe," he said, threading the silk through a minute puncture he made with the hat-pin, "that one may suspend a small object beneath this innocent-looking cover. A glass ampule, fragments of Mr. Hobart's broken Venetian vessel would serve admirably, may dangle like Damocles' sword within the preserve itself. The thread, being fine, remains invisible to casual observation, while the paper cover shows nothing more suspicious than a pinhole." He demonstrated the mechanism with practiced precision, allowing the thread to support a small weight within the jar. It requires only the ceremonial stirring, Martin's customary reach for the crabapple preserve, and the fragile vessel breaks, delivering its lethal contents directly into what the victim believes to be his harmless, theatrical preparation. Dr. Puckridge, who had been watching this demonstration with the horrified fascination of one witnessing the dissection of his own professional failures, cleared his throat meaningfully. "The digitalis would have been prepared in concentrated form, I assume, sufficient to cause rapid cardiac arrest rather than the gradual symptoms Martin expected from his fake poison." "Precisely," Wimsey confirmed, lifting the jar and allowing the demonstration thread to snap with a sharp twang. The loose end flew toward the aspidistra with malicious accuracy, catching among its leaves exactly as the crimson fibre they had discovered yesterday. "We found such evidence among the foliage, not in the kitchen, not near the dresser, but here, where the broken thread would naturally fall during the fatal stirring." Inspector Craddock's notebook had appeared with practiced efficiency, though his expression suggested a man grappling with mechanisms more complex than his usual rural investigations provided. "The timing, Lord Peter. How could Lady Kellow ensure that Martin would consume the poison at the precise moment required?" "She couldn't," Wimsey replied with evident satisfaction at the question's perspicacity. "Which is why she relied upon Martin's own theatrical instincts to provide the necessary precision. He had arranged his performance down to the minute. The muffled funeral bell, the 5-minute clock discrepancy, the assembled witnesses. Lady Kello merely ensured that when the curtain rose on his carefully orchestrated drama, the poison would be genuine rather than theatrical. He moved to the French windows, consulting his pocket watch with the precision of a chronometer. The acoustic deception proved particularly elegant. "Mrs. Treadgold, if you would ring the handbell when you hear the church toll." The muffled stroke, wandering upon the wind like a confession reluctantly delivered, arrived thick and delayed. Mrs. Treadgold rang obediently, while Wimsey noted his timepiece with academic satisfaction. 5 minutes discrepancy, he announced. Yesterday's performance was timed to this confused chronology, a bell that sounded like a quarter-hour chime, a clock that declared the quarter when the hour had already passed. Lady Kello could arrange her substitution to the minute, while swearing honestly that the timing was otherwise. Lady Kello's composure, which had survived accusations of blackmail and suggestions of continental conspiracy, showed its first hairline crack. "Your apparatus is ingenious, Lord Peter, but you cannot prove my hand upon it. Speculation, however elegant, remains merely speculation." "On the contrary," Wimsey replied with that harassed kindness which, in him, often preceded devastating precision. "Elsie, you met Lady Kello at the rectory gate Tuesday morning, did you not? You admired her hat, she mentioned a slipped pin, and you offered yours just for a moment." The girl's face crumpled with dawning comprehension. "Yes, my lord. Her ladyship returned it when she left, placed it on the salver. Mrs. Treadgold put it in the drawer with the napkins when she tidied up." "The drawer containing the sugar basin," Wimsey observed. "Which is why the napkins were damp before they had properly cooled. Mrs. Treadgold, practical soul that she is, rinsed what appeared sticky. The hatpin bore traces of the digitalis preparation, and though the evidence has been inadvertently destroyed, the sequence of events speaks with sufficient clarity. Mrs. Treadgold's eyes had closed in horror at her unwitting destruction of evidence. God forgive me, I thought I was merely maintaining proper standards. There remains one additional voice to be heard," Wimsey continued, his tone growing more serious. "Mrs. Venns. Her complaint about preserve that smelled of bitter almonds and foreign spices suggests she encountered Lady Kello's preliminary experiments. Digitalis possesses no such aromatic properties, but certain other preparations do, and they act with considerably more dispatch than theatrical requirements would demand." The silence that followed was broken by Lady Kello's sharp intake of breath. "The old woman meddled," she said with conversational precision. "She peered into matters that did not concern her, threatened to expose what she could not possibly understand. If she died of her own excessive curiosity." "Perhaps," Wimsey said quietly, "though I suspect an inquest will discover that her constitution proved unequal to more than mere curiosity. The muffled bells that provided such atmospheric accompaniment to Martin's tragedy were adjusted Monday evening. Most convenient timing for ensuring a funeral at precisely 3 o'clock Tuesday afternoon. Lady Kello drew off one glove with meticulous care, as though removing the last vestige of domestic propriety. The hand beneath was white, capable, and entirely steady. You leave me no position that is not ridiculous, Lord Peter. If I deny, I become a coward. If I confess, I become a melodrama. I chose, throughout this affair, the course that would bring least humiliation to the family name. You have chosen otherwise." Wimsey bowed with genuine sadness. "Noblesse oblige, Lady Kello makes a poor excuse for poison. The Greeks, whom I doubtless misquote, had something to say about necessary evils. They were considerably better at tragedy than we moderns. They kept it properly confined to the stage." As Inspector Craddock prepared to escort her from the drawing-room that had witnessed both her nephew's theatrical ambitions and her own deadly pragmatism, Lady Kello paused at the threshold without looking back. "If you must know the complete truth," she said, her voice carrying the flat certainty of one who had calculated costs with actuarial precision, "I did not intend murder initially. The boy had made himself an instrument of his own destruction. The continental correspondence, the mystical suicide pact, the carefully timed collapse before impeccable witnesses. I merely ensured that the performance achieved its intended effect. There is no sin in such efficiency, Lord Peter, only skill." She departed with Inspector Craddock, her black silk rustling with the dignity of one who viewed arrest as merely another social inconvenience, to be endured with appropriate grace. The drawing-room, emptied of its principal performer, seemed to exhale slowly, like a theatre after the final curtain. Wimsey remained beside the mantelpiece, contemplating the widow's teacup that had first alerted him to the deception's true nature. It sat empty now, its porcelain surface reflecting the grey afternoon. Light with cold precision, a witness that had observed everything and revealed nothing until properly questioned. "The game," he murmured to the assembled company, "has been played with remarkable skill, though I confess myself unsurprised by its resolution. In my experience, the most dangerous conspiracies are invariably domestic ones, and the most lethal poisons are those administered by loving relatives who have calculated the precise value of family affection against the cost of family reputation." Outside the French windows, the Dorset afternoon continued its grey performance, indifferent to human dramas of murder and justice. The church bell spoke plainly now, unmuffled and altogether too honest for comfort, while time itself resumed its normal, reliable progression after a brief period of theatrical manipulation. Louise Aspidistra stood in silent judgment over a drawing-room where continental mysteries had proved to be merely decorative, flourishes upon a thoroughly, recognizably, and lethally English crime, committed with all the punctuality and attention to detail that characterized the finest domestic arrangements, and solved through the precise application of observation, logic, and that peculiar English genius for detecting calculated malice beneath the most civilized of circumstances. The widow's teacup, finally empty of both tea and secrets, bore witness to the resolution of a case where nothing had been quite what it seemed, and where the most elaborate foreign conspiracies had served merely to camouflage a murder, as quintessentially English as afternoon tea itself. The village absorbed scandal with the resigned digestion of an elderly python, slowly, visibly, and with a certain reptilian grace that suggested long experience in processing the indigestible. By morning, the bell spoke in its ordinary voice, Mr. Bligh having relieved it of both muffling and moral ambiguity with the thoroughness of one performing necessary penance. Hobart's establishment displayed shutters for the first time in living memory, while a discreet pair of plainclothesmen took educational interest in his ledgers and correspondence. Miss Deverell, no longer the tempestuous Celestine, but a sensible girl with a fortnight's wages and bruised theatrical ambitions, departed on the 10:15, her modest valise preceding her down the platform like a flag of dignified retreat. Inspector Craddock found Wimsey in the vicarage garden, where that gentleman was examining the morning air with the absorbed attention of a connoisseur evaluating a particularly complex vintage. The inspector bore the satisfied exhaustion of one who had successfully navigated the treacherous waters between village politics and criminal justice. "We have sufficient evidence for the Crown," Craddock announced without triumph, consulting his notebook with professional thoroughness. "Hobart will answer to half a dozen charges besides conspiracy to defraud, and there's a London firm whose business model has engaged Scotland Yard's particular interest. As for Lady Kellow," he hesitated, his official composure softening slightly, "she maintains her dignity, though her solicitor appears to be a gentleman who prefers heavy curtains to natural light." "Solicitors," Wimsey observed with philosophical detachment, "owe much to atmospheric lighting. The profession could hardly flourish under skylights. Tell me, Inspector, was it merely money and reputation or something more fundamental?" Craddock's pencil hovered over a fresh page, as though reluctant to spoil its pristine surface with anything as untidy as human motivation. "I'd value your assessment, Lord Peter. The manner in which she spoke of it suggested something beyond simple avarice." "Order," Wimsey replied, turning a fallen rose petal between finger and thumb with the delicate precision of one examining evidence. Her creed was order, Inspector. Martin represented chaos incarnate, financial, moral, temporal. He tampered with time itself and the family name in a single afternoon. She corrected both aberrations with a preparation and a pin. They proceeded to the drawing-room, where Mrs. Treadgold had restored every article to its proper position with penitential exactitude. The French clock, after considerable mechanical persuasion, now condescended to tell the same time as the rest of civilized society. Wimsey regarded it with the wary benevolence of one extending truce to a reformed but fundamentally unreliable character. "Set to the post office standard," Mrs. Treadgold announced with evident satisfaction. "We shall follow His Majesty's mails rather than the vagaries of Dorset wind henceforth." "A wise conversion," Wimsey agreed solemnly. "The General Post Office may be dilatory, but it rarely muffles itself for dramatic effect." Dr. Puckridge presented himself with a humility that transformed his usual professional authority into something approaching genuine contrition. "Lord Peter, I have provided Inspector Craddock with a complete statement regarding my educational discussions with Lady Kellow concerning cardiac medications. I fear my explanations were rather too thorough for public safety." "They were precisely thorough enough for judicial purposes," Wimsey replied with kindly precision. "If one must inadvertently instruct murderers, Doctor, let it be in language the Crown Prosecutor can quote with confidence. In future, when ladies inquire with unusual persistence about glycosides, I suggest prescribing chicken broth and constitutional walks." The afternoon tea service proceeded with ceremonial restoration of proper domestic ritual. Mrs. Treadgold poured with renewed authority. The timing synchronized to Greenwich rather than local atmospheric conditions, while each participant accepted their cup as though participating in a sacrament of reconciliation with civilized routine. "The Continental correspondence?" the Reverend Treadgold inquired with pastoral concern. "For the complete catalogue of wickedness, were those societies genuinely engaged in mystical practices, or merely elaborate theatrical decoration?" "Both, I'm afraid," Wimsey replied, producing a foreign letter that had arrived with the Morning Post. Martin's educational sojourn had indeed connected him with certain intelligence networks, masquerading as esoteric societies. The suicide demonstration was to provide documentary proof of his reliability for future operations. To observe this charming communication from his former associates, he read aloud with theatrical precision, "Raven, we are satisfied with the witnesses and timing of your demonstration. Do not correspond further. Our requirements have been met." He refolded the letter with distaste. How fortunate that transcendence has been outsourced to the Postal Service. They accept Martin's actual death as fulfilling his contractual obligations. However it was accomplished, Mrs. Treadgold, emboldened by the return to familiar domestic territory, ventured the question that had been troubling her throughout the affair's resolution. "Lord Peter, what first alerted you to Lady Kellow's deception? How did you penetrate such elaborate planning?" Wimsey smiled with genuine warmth, his monocle catching the afternoon light, as he contemplated the elegant simplicity of the inquiry. The widow's teacup, Mrs. Treadgold, it remained full. In a household where every detail of tea service follows established ritual, where every preference receives accommodation, an untouched cup suggested knowledge rather than superstition. Lady Kellow abstained not from funeral observances but from refreshments she knew to be harmless because she had ensured the poison was delivered through entirely different means. The church bell tolled 4 o'clock with refreshing honesty, its voice clear and unadorned, now that the requirements of theatrical mourning had concluded. The sound carried across the village with reliable precision, marking time that had resumed its normal progression, after a brief period of calculated manipulation. Rising from his chair with the satisfied air of one whose intellectual exercise had reached its natural conclusion, Wimsey consulted his pocket watch with renewed respect for temporal accuracy. "The game has been played with remarkable skill, though I confess myself unsurprised by its English resolution. The most dangerous conspiracies, in my experience, are invariably domestic ones, and the most lethal poisons are those administered by loving relatives who have calculated the precise value of family affection against the cost of family reputation." He moved toward the door, pausing to regard the aspidistra, which had resumed its customary air of vegetable disapproval now that its services as evidence repository were no longer required. "Mrs. Treadgold, you will continue to pour at the proper quarter hour even should mechanical difficulties arise. By Greenwich Mean Time, Lord Peter," she declared with the firmness of religious conviction. "Then Dorset is saved," Wimsey pronounced solemnly, extending his hand to the vicar. "Preach your sermon on pride and vanity, Reverend, but add a third word, mercy. It has become unfashionable to advocate it, but the fashion does not suit English character. Outside, the wind toyed with the hedges in an absent-minded fashion, as though deciding whether to return to honest weather or continue its operatic pretensions. Inspector Craddock accompanied Wimsey to the garden gate, where the Daimler waited with mechanical patience. "You will attend the assizes?" Craddock inquired with professional courtesy. "I shall send flowers," Wimsey replied with characteristic deflection. "They speak less and wilt more quickly than witnesses. Thank Bunter for my attendance to duty, Inspector. He maintains both my shirts and my conscience in proper condition. As for justice, a fiat justitia, let it be done. The heavens will not fall." Dorset is constructed of sterner materials. The engine consented to its duties with aristocratic reluctance as Wimsey settled behind the wheel. Beyond the village, the Channel continued its eternal sulking, practicing eternity with provincial determination. He paused to observe it with amused sympathy. "The minor poets again," he remarked to the indifferent sea breeze. "One really shouldn't encourage them. They make such theatrical weather." As the motorcar negotiated the lane with dignified efficiency, the village settled into its improved chronology. Tea would be poured at correct intervals, the French clock would obey when properly addressed, and the widow's teacup would sit decorously full again when superstition required. But never. The household felt with respectful certainty when it harbored secrets requiring revelation. The drawing-room, emptied of its mysteries and restored to honest domestic purpose, seemed to exhale with relief. Truth, properly ventilated, had proven an excellent disinfectant, leaving the aspidistra upright, the preserves correctly labelled, and the clocks, after appropriate mechanical persuasion, telling reliable time. Murder, like the weather, had blown over. But the air carried a cleaner scent for those with sufficient sensitivity to detect the difference. In the peculiar mathematics of English village life, order had been restored through the precise application of logic, observation, and that characteristic national genius for detecting calculated malice beneath the most civilized of circumstances. The widow's teacup, finally empty of both contents and secrets, stood as silent testimony to the resolution of a case where continental mysteries had served merely as elaborate decoration for a crime as quintessentially English as afternoon tea itself. The Daimler departed Dorset with that peculiar combination of mechanical satisfaction and atmospheric relief that suggested even motor cars possessed. Opinions about prolonged exposure to village scandal. Wimsey settled into the driver's seat with the contemplative air of one whose intellectual exercise had reached its natural conclusion, though his gaze lingered on the receding landscape with the thoughtful attention of a scholar reviewing recently a completed research that the Morning Post had delivered its customary burden of explanation and consequence. Inspector Craddock's neat official hand reported that Lady Kellow's solicitor had applied for a hearing with every appearance of injured innocence, though the Crown proposed to proceed upon the digitalis evidence with mathematical certainty. Hobart, faced with ledgers full of civic malice, had elected to become eloquent about his continental associates, while Crenshaw and Associates were being dismantled with surgical precision by gentlemen who described their occupation as clerical work and their hobby as maintaining the peace. From Miss Deverell, late of Paris and presently of Sydenham, came a note in competent feminine hand upon modest stationery. "I am not ashamed," she had written with defiant honesty. "I acted a part for money. I shall act better parts for less. I have secured a small position understudying the second maid at the Queen's Theatre, and am determined, henceforth, to confine my murders to the stage. If you thought me a fool, I forgive you. If you thought me cruel, I deny it." Wimsey had sent flowers without attaching a card. They performed better work unclaimed. The Reverend Treadgold's parcel contained the small pocket watch from Hobart's establishment, the one reputed to have stopped at a mystical moment of transcendence. It had in fact stopped at 23 minutes past 3 in a manner entirely mechanical. When wound, it consented to tick with the renewed vigor of rehabilitated piety. "We have rehung the bell clapper," the vicar added in his accompanying note. "Mrs. Treadgold has adopted Greenwich Mean Time with a fervour that alarms me for her theology." The aspidistra makes no comment. As the countryside flowed past with its deceptive tranquillity, Wimsey found his thoughts returning to Lady Kellow's final declaration. There is no sin in such efficiency, only skill. It was the absolute conviction in her own righteousness that proved most chilling, the unshakable belief that she had merely corrected an aberration in the natural order of things, Martin, with his continental affectations and blackmailing schemes, had not merely threatened her reputation, he had threatened the very fabric of her universe, an ancient and ordered cosmos where certain things simply were not done, and where family honor, however tarnished, remained paramount. Her solution, though horrific, was in its own warped way a logical extension of her principles. The Greeks had a word for it, Wimsey murmured to the empty passenger seat. Hubris. Though I fancy Lady Keller would have considered it merely good housekeeping. The case had resolved itself through attention to what Parker would undoubtedly term domestic trivia. Stopped clocks, muffled bells, and the reliable unreliability of village chronometry. Yet these seemingly insignificant details had provided the mathematical precision necessary for justice. The widow's teacup, remaining full when it should have been empty, had spoken more eloquently than any witness. Mrs. Treadgold's final note confirmed the restoration of proper temporal authority. We pour at the quarter now, by Greenwich Mean Time. The vicar preaches mercy. I dust the salver daily, though it goes into the bottom of the press once the case is concluded. I do not like to think of it on the mantel. Wimsey had replied with characteristic brevity, put it away. If the clock gains, let it gain on the side of kindness. The elaborate continental correspondence, the mystical suicide societies, the talk of transcendence and ancient wisdom, all had proved to be theatrical decoration upon a thoroughly English crime. Martin's educational sojourn had indeed connected him with intelligence networks, masquerading as esoteric societies, genuine organizations with genuine purposes, however theatrical their methods. They had accepted his actual death as fulfilling his contractual obligations, regardless of how it was accomplished. Yet the true mystery had been solved not through international intrigue, but through the precise observation of domestic arrangements. The most dangerous conspiracies, Wimsey reflected, were invariably domestic ones, and the most lethal poisons were those administered by loving relatives who had calculated the exact value of family affection against the cost of family reputation, as London's familiar chaos welcomed him with its customary mixture of opportunity and threat. Wimsey consulted his pocket watch, the Dorset timepiece, now properly regulated and ticking with mechanical honesty. Time, he had learned, was the only evidence that refused cross-examination. One might persuade witnesses, bully experts, and coax juries, but time, if one could get it to speak at all, told the same story twice. The game had been played with remarkable skill, though he confessed himself unsurprised by its English resolution. Truth had emerged through the careful observation of seemingly insignificant details, teacups that remained full, clocks that told convenient rather than accurate time, and preserved jars that served purposes their manufacturers never intended. Somewhere in England, he reflected with quiet satisfaction, another mystery waited with the patience of a well-trained servant, ready to emerge when summoned by the proper combination of observation, logic, and that peculiar English genius for detecting calculated malice beneath the most civilized of circumstances. The widow's teacup, finally empty of both contents and secrets, stood as permanent testimony to the resolution of a case where continental mysteries had served merely as elaborate decoration for a crime as quintessentially English as afternoon tea itself. Bunter received the morning with that gravity which implied a private arrangement with Providence regarding the proper conduct of domestic affairs. He drew the curtains upon a London day of indiscriminate brightness, arranged the breakfast service with surgical precision, and produced, with the affected indifference of a conjurer extracting rabbits, a small stack of correspondence whose very seals suggested the satisfactory conclusion of official business. From Inspector Craddock, my lord. From the Reverend Treadgold. A communication bearing Lady Keller's hand, though much subdued in its authority. And what appears to be a theatrical programme, my lord, though I cannot account for its presence among the Morning Post. Wimsey buttered his toast with the methodical attention of one whose intellectual appetite had been recently satisfied by more complex fare. Order and method, Bunter. Begin with Craddock. The law maintains prior claim upon breakfast conversation. Bunter slit the envelope with practiced discretion. The inspector reports complete resolution, my lord. Mr. Hobart has entered upon a comprehensive confession, largely to direct attention toward the sins of others. His ledgers prove a fascinating commentary on human credulity and the international market for spiritual transcendence. The firm of Crenshaw and Associates is being wound up with exemplary neatness by gentlemen who describe their occupation as clerical work and their hobby as maintaining the peace. And Lady Kellow. Her counsel has abandoned theatrical protestations in favor of negotiating the precise terms of inevitable conviction. The Crown, however, maintains its mathematical certainty regarding digitalis residue and temporal evidence. The widow's teacup, Inspector Craddock notes with some satisfaction, has provided the most eloquent testimony of his career. Wimsey nodded with quiet satisfaction. Continue, Bunter. The Reverend's intelligence, if you please. Mr. Treadgold reports the restoration of proper chronological authority throughout the parish. The French clock now obeys Greenwich Mean Time with religious devotion. Tea is poured at correct intervals, regardless of atmospheric conditions, and Mrs. Treadgold has banished the owl-shaped tea cosy on theological grounds. He encloses the pocket watch from Hobart's establishment, now keeping honest time in the vestry, and mentions that the aspidistra has resumed its customary disapproval of human folly, though it appears rather proud of its role in revealing criminal evidence. Sound ecclesiology at last, Wimsey observed, and the subdued communication from her ladyship. Bunter's eyebrow indicated delicate territory. A brief note, my lord, in a hand much altered from its former authority. I am advised to write nothing. I write, therefore, to say only that I am no more ashamed now than yesterday, and not less certain of the necessity of my actions. I regret the aspidistra, it never offended me. Signed simply A.K. Aristotle would have admired her syllogism, Wimsey murmured with a sigh that acknowledged certain lost graces in the age. And the theatrical program. Miss Deverell, no longer styling herself Celestine, has secured a position as second maid at the Queen's Theatre, my lord. She performs this evening, with 3 intelligible lines and the prospect of wages honestly earned. There appears to be a vacancy in the second row. As the morning progressed, through that selection of London noises which suggested a metropolis forever rehearsing its lines without quite achieving performance, Wimsey found himself contemplating the peculiar mathematics of the Dorset affair. The case had revealed the fundamental tension between ancient systems of order and modern innovations in chaos. Lady Kellow's universe operating according to principles that brooked no deviation, while Martin's continental affectations and blackmailing schemes had threatened the very fabric of her carefully maintained world. The beauty of English crime, Bunter, he observed, lies not in its exotic methodology but in its domestic precision. Lady Kellow possessed 3 crucial advantages: intimate knowledge of household routine, legitimate access during critical periods, and complete awareness of her nephew's theatrical intentions. She transformed his elaborate performance into genuine murder through the simple expedient of superior domestic knowledge. The afternoon brought Parker, hat in hand and conscience in order, bearing the final intelligence regarding continental complications. The mystical suicide societies proved genuine enough, he reported with characteristic efficiency, though their interest lay in intelligence work rather than spiritual transcendence. They required documented demonstrations from potential agents. 23 previous cases, all following Martin's intended pattern. They've accepted his actual death as fulfilling contractual obligations, however accomplished, and departed for more hospitable territories. One must not be unkind to travellers, Wimsey observed. Their journeys are humiliating enough without official harassment. Evening found them in Drury Lane, where gaslight proved kind to aspiring actresses and indifferent to detectives. Miss Deverell, thoroughly decelestined and glowing with honest accomplishment, delivered her 3 lines with such clarity that they carried to the back of the house, and as Wimsey assured her afterward, probably reached Dorset itself. I am not ashamed of acting for money, Lord Peter, she declared with defiant honesty over modest refreshment. I shall act better parts for less, confine my murders to the stage, and trust that honest wages prove more reliable than continental romance. Wisdom beyond your years, Wimsey replied with genuine warmth. The theatre has this advantage over life. It knows when to drop the curtain. Later, in the quiet of his Piccadilly flat, Wimsey stood with teacup in hand, properly filled, honestly brewed, and entirely innocent of criminal purpose. The fire settled into comfortable contemplation, while London fog pressed against the windows with the persistence of unresolved mysteries. "To temporal precision, Bunter," he said, raising his cup in salute to the resolution of a case where nothing had been quite what it seemed, "the only witness who refuses cross-examination, and to domestic arrangements, the most dangerous conspiracies are invariably the most familiar ones." Bunter inclined his head with appropriate gravity. "And to tea, my lord, if I may add a second toast, the only ceremony that improves with sincerity." They drank in companionable silence while the clock, properly regulated and entirely reliable, marked honest time. Somewhere in the ordered chaos of English life, another mystery waited with the patience of a well-trained servant, ready to emerge when summoned by the proper combination of observation, logic, and that peculiar national genius for detecting calculated malice beneath the most civilized of circumstances. "Come, Bunter," Wimsey said finally, setting his cup upon its saucer with decision. "Tomorrow will be quite untidy enough without our assistance. Atque in perpetuum, frater, av atque vale. Not Horace this time, but Catullus, and no misquotation that I am aware of." "Very good, my lord," said Bunter, as if cataloguing inventory rather than poetry. He drew the curtains with their satisfactory whisper, and the day, like a well-bred caller, took the hint and withdrew. The widow's teacup had told its tale complete, requiring only proper observation to reveal that the most dangerous poisons are invariably those served by loving relatives, with afternoon tea and appropriate ceremony. In the peculiar mathematics of English village life, even the most carefully calculated schemes remained subject to the unpredictable variables of human observation and the inexorable logic of truth, served with precisely the right amount of milk.